Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's program on why patients should participate in clinical trials, presented by the Foundation for Peripheral Neuropathy and generously sponsored by Eli Lilly. I am super excited to welcome our expert speaker, Jennifer Gawanter from the University of Rochester Medical Center, to discuss the contributions you can make to the future of peripheral neuropathy research. My name is Lindsay Colbert, and I am the Executive Director of the Foundation for Peripheral Neuropathy. On behalf of the organization, its staff, and dedicated board members and volunteers, I thank you all for entrusting us with providing valuable educational resources as you navigate your journey living with neuropathy. Before we begin today's program, I just want to quickly remind everyone of a few logistical items. First, yes, we are recording today's live program, and it will be emailed to all registrants and also permanently housed on the Foundation's website, along with the accompanying slide deck for your future reference. For those who are in attendance live today, we will be carving out time at the end of the presentation for a Q&A. Please use the questions box in the dashboard of this platform to ask any questions that are general in nature and on topic. We will not be able to answer any personalized medical questions today, rather answer questions that are helpful to the greater audience. And lastly, we do offer closed captioning for those who are in need, and that can also be switched on in your dashboard. Now, I'm pleased to welcome and introduce our expert today, Jennifer Gawanter, who is an associate professor at the University of Rochester, a former associate director of the Action Public-Private Partnership, and the principal investigator of the University of Rochester Clinical Hub of the NIH-sponsored Early Phase Pain Investigation Clinical Network, also known as EPICNet. Her research and scholarly activities are focused on optimizing the design, execution, and transparent dissemination of clinical trials for pain and peripheral neuropathy treatments, as well as researching interventions for painful neuropathy. She has authored over 100 peer-reviewed publications and has served as an associate editor of the Clinical Journal of Pain and Company section editor of Pain Medicine. She has mentored over 40 medical students, residents, postdoctoral fellows, and clinical faculty in clinical research and scientific writing. We are extremely lucky to have her speak on this topic. And with that, I'm excited to pass the virtual mic over to you, Dr. Gawanter. Thank you again.
Hi, Lindsay. Thank you for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for coming today. For those of you who are people living with peripheral neuropathy, I'd like to start my talk by saying thank you to those of you who have participated in clinical research or who are thinking about it, because without you, we could not do the work that we do. So today I'm going to talk about a little bit about research in general, different types of or stages of research, to give a little bit of background about what to expect if you join a clinical trial. I am then going to be talking about the things that I would want my loved one to know if they were considering joining clinical research, and then give you one example of my own research from a trial of peripheral neuropathy to illustrate the amount of impact that you can have just by participating in one research study. So let me see if I can figure this out. Yeah. Okay. Oh, good. It's working. Sorry. So for conflict of interest, Eli Lilly is a sponsor of this seminar, and I do serve as a consultant for them, and I am an investigator in one of their clinical trials. I also want to acknowledge that Neurometrics, which is a company that no longer owns this technology, but at the time was the manufacturer of a TENS device that I'm going to talk about in my own clinical research. And they provided the TENS units for my clinical trial, so I want to acknowledge that. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about why I study pain and peripheral neuropathy. Chronic pain affects over 100 million American adults, and it costs up to $635 billion per year in medical costs and lost productivity. So it is a very important problem in our country. A lot of people think, and it's true, that at least in part, treatment for chronic pain has contributed to the opioid epidemic, which is a big problem in our country as well. So finding novel therapies for pain is a really important way to help improve not only pain for people who are living with chronic pain, but also help at a societal level. And we know that most treatments for chronic pain are only modestly effective and do not work for everyone. So there is a big need here. And then for me personally, my mom lived with chronic pain for the majority of her adult life, and that is how I was inspired to start working in this field. So as I mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about what types of clinical trials there are, and what the progression and development of a new treatment looks like from the perspective of development. And I'm going to use FDA approval as an example and speak mainly about drugs, although obviously devices and other treatments are important for pain and peripheral neuropathy as well. So in phase one, what we call phase one trials, what we're evaluating is the safety of a new drug that comes in from preclinical models. So we discovered preclinically this might work for people with pain or people with peripheral neuropathy. Now we want to see if it's safe. And so these studies are generally fairly small. They usually start in healthy volunteers who don't have the condition of interest, depending on some different things. And then we determine, okay, this seems safe. The next phase, if passes the safety, is what we call an early proof of concept clinical trial. So this would be a small study, a relatively small study, where we're trying to just see, does this have some promise? And so things can progress either from phase one into phase two, or potentially, which has happened quite frequently in our field, from an already available drug that is available for something else, for example, mental health conditions or epilepsy for pain. That's a way that we've developed drugs in the past. And we start kind of at this phase two level in the pipeline with new drugs. We call it repurposing. So then if something shows promise in a preliminary smaller phase two trial, then we go to phase three. These are generally quite large clinical trials. They randomize people to an active treatment or what we call a placebo treatment, which is a treatment that similar to the active, the way it looks, but it doesn't have the active ingredient. And then generally, there are multiple pathways to approval, but the regular one requires 2 of these large studies to show what we call a significant treatment effect versus placebo of your new drug in order to become FDA approved. And things have to be approved by the FDA before they make it to new patients. Or before they make it to patients, I'm sorry. So this is what we call the pipeline of drug development. And what I'd like you to take away from this is, A, it takes a while, and B, we need a lot of people to volunteer their time generously to be willing to be involved in this if we want to create new therapies that then become available widely to patients. So the next thing I want to talk about briefly is what types of roles are there for people living with peripheral neuropathy in research. And the first is something that we call research partners. So these are people who actually sit down with researchers like me. They volunteer their time and they discuss study plans with the investigators to help us design the best possible studies. The main types of things that I usually ask participants or patient partners about are things like, what are the best outcomes? What's the most important thing to you? What do you want to see improved? What kind of entry criteria, which that means the things that people have to, the criteria they have to meet in order to enroll in the trial. What types of entry criteria might make it really hard for people to get in the study? How can we make sure that enough people will be able to join? And even if we catch it early enough in the program, we can even sometimes help participants really help design the intervention. So just for an example, I'm working on developing a yoga intervention. And so that's something that people living with pain or people living with peripheral neuropathy can really help me design from the very beginning. It's not a drug, obviously those types of things, there's less wiggle room. But for me, there's a really big component that can be influenced by patients and what they want. Another big thing is the recruitment materials. So what types of language makes the study appealing? What types of things would make it kind of be off-putting? How do we present this to people? What types of images should we use? What kind of methods should we use to find people who might be interested and connect with them? So this is what we call a patient partner. And these people usually will be on the study team. They're a very important part of the study team. They get paid for their time. And it's for people who are really interested in research and thinking about ways to contribute to research other than simply participating in a clinical trial. So that's one way you can get involved. Another way is through being a research participant. Sorry, this is taking a long time. Okay, thank you. Is being a research participant. And this is a little bit more straightforward and something that you might be a little bit more familiar with. So these people generously donate their time. And then when they join a trial, they receive an experimental treatment or control, what I was referring to as the placebo group in a drug trial. They would complete questionnaires either at visits or at home. They might undergo some testing, medical testing. They might provide a biological sample, for example, blood. So these people are participating in the research. They're being what we call, research participants. They're following the protocol. We collect the data, and their participation allows us to test whether treatments are effective. So it's an extremely important role in the development of new therapies. Okay, so I just wanted to touch base briefly on the different types of roles patients can play. But now I want to talk a little bit about things that might be kind of confusing when you think about a clinical trial and what I would want my loved ones to know if they came to me and they were like, why should I join this trial? Why do we have to do it this way? And so the first thing I think that's important to understand, because it is a negative, like it's not a great thing. Like if you get enrolled in a trial, you're excited, you want to try something, and then there's a good chance you'll get a placebo. And so why do we even have to have this? Why is it necessary? Why put people through a trial getting a placebo? And so I want to make sure that you all understand what the value of it is. And so this graph is seems intuitive to me because I'm used to looking at it all the time, and sometimes I forget that it's not for everyone. But if you look at the y-axis, what I'm plotting here is the outcome score. So let's say your pain intensity related to your neuropathy. And this is the average. This dot represents the average of all the people at time 1. And then we have some kind of intervention, and then we measure the pain again at time 2. And this was a very successful treatment. The pain went from quite high on average to quite low on average. And what I would like to kind of relay is this treatment, this change in pain, you might just look at this and think like, oh, wow, that treatment really improves pain. That's great. But what's important to note is that the treatment effect, meaning the effect of the drug itself, is only a small part of what actually happens from time 1 to time 2, contributing to the ratings of pain by these patients. And other things that can contribute to this decrease is a natural variation in pain. So, for example, a lot of times people will join a trial when their symptoms are at their worst because they really want to try something new, and so they join a trial. So we think of this as something called regression to the mean, that over time, naturally, some people who join the trial might just get better regardless of whatever the treatment is doing. There's also sustained interaction with the study staff. We know that for conditions that are symptomatic, meaning like pain or sleep, like these kinds of things, a big component of it is how you're feeling in other aspects of your life, and having sustained interaction with someone who cares about your pain, thinks about your pain, thinks about you, can sometimes help improve your pain or your peripheral neuropathy symptoms, regardless of the treatment effect. And then, of course, there is what we call the expectation of treatment effect, or people sometimes just call this the placebo effect, but really the placebo effect is made up of a lot of things, of these 3 things together. We would call these would be effects that would occur in the placebo group as well as the treatment group. And so that's why it's so important for our clinical trials to include a placebo group, because we want to know what is the true effect of this treatment, not just of starting a clinical trial and going from point A to point B in time, and how does your pain change. And the reason for that is, I have pretty mixed feelings about the placebo effect, or the idea of placebo, right? Because on the one hand, it's like placebo is great. We want our treatments to work as well as they can. Who cares if it's placebo? But on the other hand, especially for things that are expensive or they might come with a lot of risk, it's really important to know that the effect we're getting from those things are actually from the treatment, not from like some kind of placebo effect or these what we call non-specific effects. And that's why we randomize in placebo-controlled trials. And that's why we do research in this way, and why it's so important that people are willing to be randomized to a placebo treatment. Okay, so the next thing I would want people to know is why, or want to tell people about, is why do phase 3 trials have to be so large? For a pain study, a phase 3 trial can easily have, 300 or more people in it. That seems like a lot of people and a lot of time and a lot of resources. Why do we need that? And so one of the main reasons, there's many reasons why we need that, which could take like a whole lecture. So I'm not going to talk about a lot of them, but I just want to explain that pain is variable. Peripheral neuropathy is variable. People present with different symptoms, different types of pain. And so we don't necessarily know exactly how to identify the right person to put in every single trial, the right set of symptoms. And so what we need to do then is we need to enroll a lot of people so that when there's a lot, if there is variability in the effect, we can still see it. And that's something called assay sensitivity, or the ability of your trial to detect a true treatment effect if there is one. And the other thing we're interested in by enrolling a lot of people is that we want the results to be generalizable. If we only enrolled a very few number of people in the studies with very narrow characteristics, then our results wouldn't necessarily apply to everyone else out there who might be getting this treatment, and we want them to. So these are two of the reasons why we need so many people. We need volunteers who are willing to help us with our research. And so then the last thing I want you to know, and this is what the whole rest of my talk is going to be about, is that even participation in just one clinical trial can have a far-reaching impact, not just on the main goal that you'll hear about when someone tries to tell you about a clinical trial they'd like you to enroll in. They'll tell you about the drug, they'll tell you about what they're hoping to do, which is to show that the drug works, right? And so you might think that all your participation does is help people figure out if this treatment works, but it's really so much more than that, or can be, and that's what I'd like to tell you. And in order to tell you that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of my own research. And this is a clinical trial of a transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation device for chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy. This trial was published in the Journal of Pain, and so if you are interested and you like reading primary sources, you can find this article already out there. But I'm going to tell you pretty much the highlights of the study. So this study included people who had received chemotherapy that causes neuropathy, and they had finished that chemotherapy at least 3 months ago, and they were diagnosed with chronic CIPN, or chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy, which means that although their treatment for chemo had finished, they still had it for at least 3 months. And they had to have at least 2 of the following symptoms at a severity that they rated at least 4 out of 10 on their worst symptom in a day. And these were sharp shooting pain, hot burning pain, numbness, tingling, cramping, things that if you have peripheral neuropathy or a loved one with peripheral neuropathy, you're probably quite familiar with. The intervention is a TENS device. It's pictured here in this picture. It's worn in a band around the leg right below the knee and controlled by an app. And the active device is worn for 1 hour sessions, it turns itself on and off for an hour on and an hour off. And we asked people in the trial to wear it for 5 hours, which would equal 3 hours of stimulation. And then we had a placebo device that would emit a little bit of stimulation to kind of mimic what it would feel like to wear the device. But what we thought was likely not as therapeutic as the 3 hours of stimulation. And then we asked people to do this for 6 weeks, and that was the primary endpoint. So this is what we call a consort diagram. If you read a clinical trial, it kind of tells you where everybody who started and how far they got. And the details aren't important. What's important is that we were able to get 151 participants recruited in 2 years at 6 sites throughout the country, and 91% of the participants were retained in the clinical trial. And this actually occurred through the height of COVID. So this was a really big feat and a really great testament to what the participants were willing to come out and do this and help us with our research, even though COVID was happening and there was like all this crazy stuff happening in the world at the time. And what we found was that on our main outcome, which is an outcome of all different types of neuropathy symptoms put together, so numbness, tingling, all different things, we were able to find a slight improvement in this outcome in both the placebo and the active group, and there was a small difference between groups. But the p-value, which generally in a clinical trial, we're looking for a p-value of less than 0.05 if it's one of those big phase 3 confirmatory trials I mentioned. But for this trial, we had set a threshold that was less rigorous, because the higher the value, the less rigorous the trial is. And we set it for 0.2. So we got really lucky. We just made it. But I had hypothesized or guessed at the beginning of the study that if it were going to work on anything, the most likely thing it would work on would be the different painful symptoms. And so I also did an analysis of those painful symptoms separately. Sorry, it's delayed. Oh, there we go. And you can see that when I took the people who had each of these symptoms at the beginning, so hot burning pain, sharp shooting pain, cramping, and we compared the improvements in those symptoms specifically in an outcome that looked at just those symptoms separately, we started to see much bigger decreases from both the placebo and the active group, but the difference was much larger. And I know it doesn't look that much larger because this is a difference of 1 and this is a difference of like 1.2 to 1.4-ish, but this scale is much bigger. This scale is 0 to 80 and this scale is only 0 to 10. So this numeric difference is actually much larger compared to the scale. And you can see the p-values go down quite a bit. Obviously not anywhere near 0.05, but the numbers are quite small. And importantly, something that I think was really important for the study is that we did not see the same differences in the two non-painful symptoms that I had hypothesized it might not work on, tingling and numbness. And you can see those differences are much smaller and the p-values are very high. So this was really good preliminary evidence to me that TENS can actually improve the painful symptoms associated with peripheral neuropathy. So, and one thing I just wanted to mention, because again, to kind of put in reference how big this 1.37 or 1.21 difference between groups is on a 0 to 10 scale, which is how we measure them. When you look at, there's a clinical trial of duloxetine, which is a treatment that is approved for other neuropathic pains. And there was a large clinical trial done in chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy pain. They found a significant effect, and because of that trial, duloxetine is recommended by the American Society of Clinical Oncology for the treatment of painful CIPN. And their difference between the two groups was only 0.73. So you can see that's like, only a little over half the difference here. So it just kind of puts in perspective that this difference we're seeing is quite large for people who aren't used to really thinking about between group differences in research, in pain research. Okay, so one thing that I want to point out is what's challenging with this research is that what I showed you in the previous slide was that it looks like TENS might work for hot burning pain, for sharp shooting pain, for cramping, but everyone has different sets of these symptoms, right? And if you look at this Venn diagram, what I'm showing you is these are the number of people who reported greater than or equal to 4 out of 10 for each of these symptoms. And you can see these 17 people only reported greater than or equal to 4 out of 10 for hot burning pain, whereas these 21 people reported greater than or equal to 4 out of 10 for all of these 3 symptoms. So how can we then, so the question I was left with was, okay, I want to go forward, I want to do what we call a phase 3 trial that I mentioned at the beginning to prove that this works, more definitively. But how am I going to measure this? I want to have the best measure to be able to show what I think is a meaningful effect. And so what I did was I took these data and I played with some different outcomes. And what we found was the outcome that gave us the best ability to see this treatment difference and was intuitively the most clinically meaningful was to put into the outcome each of the symptoms that the patient actually reported as being at least moderately severe or greater than or equal to 4 out of 10. So if I go, I can't go, going back is hard, but let's see if I can do it. So if I go back, for these 21 people, their outcome would be the average of all 3 of these symptoms. But for these 17 people, it would just be the rating of their hot burning pain. And by doing it this way, what we're able to do is we're able to measure, I'm doing it. Oh. we're able to measure um, only the things that the participant actually has. And by doing so, we're able to see a bigger difference because we're not kind of washing out the signal by including a bunch of things that the participant doesn't have. And what we showed was we were able to see the biggest difference when we did it this way. And even though we only had 71 people in the study, which, if you remember, I mentioned that usually phase 3 trials have like 300 people in them, we were still able to get a p-value that's lower than 0.05, which, although is not the be all and end all, it's what the FDA uses to decide if a trial worked or didn't work. So it is important, practically speaking. So what is the impact of this trial, which again would not have been possible without the 151 people who volunteered their time and took a risk on trying this with us? The first thing is that I hope that these data will be sufficient to support funding for a phase 3 confirmatory trial, which I'm currently working on getting right now. And the result of that phase 3 trial, the reason it's so important to do is in order to get this treatment into treatment guidelines for painful CIPN, we have to have a phase 3 trial that shows that it really works. And when you get something into treatment guidelines, that's when you really can start to disseminate it. So I would love to do talks like this and tell everyone should try TENS. It works, but I really don't have the data that scientifically supports that yet. But if I did have this trial and I had these data, then I would be able to do tons of webinars. I'd be able to really go out there and say, people should try this. It does work. And the only way that something will really get disseminated is if you have that evidence. So this first study that these 151 people volunteered for allows me to hopefully start a line of research that will get to the point where we're really disseminating this treatment and people get to try it and see if it works for them. I did it again. Anyway, so the other thing, the amplified impact of this trial, is that I have written 4 additional peer-reviewed publications using these data. We've presented 6 posters at national and international meetings, and we have 2 additional papers in progress, and these are what the papers are about. They're about informing future clinical trial design, including better understanding of currently available outcome measures and to develop novel ones, like I just mentioned to you before. They are helping us to increase the understanding of the impact of pain associated with neuropathy on important health domains, and characterizing the analgesic use in patients with CIPN. So even though the primary goal of the study was to figure out if TENS is a promising treatment for CIPN that we should investigate in a larger study, all of these other findings have come out of these data that will help plan not just the future study of TENS for my research, but potentially a bunch of different investigators' research on CIPN in all different areas. The other thing that's really important to me that I want to note in terms of amplified impact is that these are all of my mentees who have been involved in these secondary analyses that have contributed to these papers and these posters. And so not only do we have the impact of the science that was created and the information that was created by these secondary analyses, what we have is the training of these young people who, sorry, my slides are really delayed, it's throwing me off. And so of these young people, and then all the great things that they will do in the world because they started training on how to do clinical research. And that opportunity was available to them because of the data from that clinical trial. And so I think it's really important to understand this part of it is really important to understanding how your participation in a clinical research study can have so much impact that's more than just helping to answer that primary question that the study is designed to answer, mainly answer. And so I want to leave you with this. I hope that I've convinced you that participating in clinical trial can be a worthwhile endeavor. And so if you want to do that, where should you look? So there are a lot of places to look. For example, the Foundation of Peripheral Neuropathy, often on their website and listservs will announce opportunities for clinical research. I actually disseminated a survey that was you were able to do online through the FPN. Clinicaltrials.gov is a website where all randomized clinical trials have to be registered, and you can search on there based on the condition of interest and your location and see what trials are open in your area. If you do have an academic medical center near you, you can look at the academic medical center's social media pages. Oftentimes they have recent research volunteer registries that you can sign up for, and you put in information about yourself and say you want to get emailed information about studies that are available. You can even email researchers directly. I've gotten emails from patients before who have found me on the internet, and they're interested and they want to know if I have any studies available. But the way I would do this, especially for peripheral neuropathy, is people studying peripheral neuropathy would likely be either in an anesthesiology or a neurology department. So you could go to your academic medical center's website, look at their departments. The departments usually have their faculty listed, and then under their faculty, they'll tell you what types of research they do. And if you did this at Rochester, where I am, you would probably at some point stumble upon my own research webpage, and I have all my active studies listed there. You can ask your doctor. So a lot of time researchers will talk with local doctors and ask them to help them recruit for their studies. But doctors are so busy and their time with you is so precious that they often forget to mention it. But if you ask them specifically for opportunities, it might jog their memory like, oh yeah, so-and-so does have this study that you might be eligible for. We often also hang flyers in doctor's offices. And I know, especially, I do this all the time. Like, instead of looking around like we used to do before we had a cell phone, if you forgot to bring a book in a waiting room, you'd constantly be reading the flyers all around you. But now because we all have our phones, oftentimes we don't even look up. So if you're looking for the opportunities when you're at your doctor's office and you're sitting there in the waiting room, look around, read the flyers. That's a place where we often try to advertise for clinical trials. And also in your community, depending on the condition, sometimes if it's something that's pretty common, we might even advertise all over the place, like coffee shops and hang our flyers wherever anyone's willing to let us. So these are the ways that I would look. Also, if you have any support groups, local support groups in your area, I forgot to put that on the flyer, but that would be another place that I would try to go to if I were looking to find volunteers who might be interested. Okay, and with that, I would just like to say thank you for your attention. Thank you to the participants who participated in our clinical trial, made it possible. Oops, sorry, I went too far. But yeah, that's it. And then also, if you do live in Rochester or the Rochester area and you are a person living with peripheral neuropathy that is painful, please feel free to contact me. We have studies open right now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Gawanter. That was amazing. We really appreciate your expertise today. Excuse me. So at this time, I wanted to take an opportunity to do a live Q&A with you so we can kind of tackle some of the items that are of interest, but that you might have not covered during your presentation. All right, fantastic. So how would you suggest patients should identify which clinical trial is best for them?
Oh boy, that is a hard question. So I think there probably won't be like tons and tons of clinical trials available to you at any given place, right? So I think a couple things, like what I would look for immediately is I would look to see what the intervention is. So for example, I've had, since I started doing peripheral neuropathy research, I've had an injectable intervention, a topical intervention, I have my TENS intervention, and an oral intervention. And so people have definitely decided based on what type of intervention, they're like, no way, I'm definitely not doing that, like for an injection. So like that would be the first thing I would look at. I would look at the side effects, like what types of side effects are known, and if there are any like pre-existing conditions that can make you more susceptible. So for example, if something has a side effect, like is known to have a nausea side effect, and you are someone who gets seasick, really seasick, that might be something that's more, you're more likely to get. So maybe I would try a different one if there were multiple options. The other thing to think about is the time commitment. So different trials have very different time commitments. And so it's important when you're going through that consenting process which is the process we use, the process that we use to really explain the trial to someone, make sure they understand what they're getting themselves into, make sure they understand all the risks. You want to pay really close attention during that process, and you want to come ready with questions. And if the research site is good, they'll have a very detailed explanation of what's required of you. And you just have to be honest with yourself. Do you have the time to commit to doing this, or is it going to be a really big pain? The other thing is, does the study reimburse for time? Like, I'm a firm believer in studies should pay participants for their time, and they should pay them well for their time. Does the study provide, if they don't pay well, do they at least provide travel so that you're not spending money out of pocket? That's what I would be looking at. And then I would be looking at the number of assessments, like how many things am I going to be asked to do? Because some studies make you do a ton of stuff. And, if you're retired, or, you just really interested in research, maybe you don't care. Maybe that's great for you. But if you're busy and you have time constraints, and maybe that's a big turnoff. Also, some people hate getting their blood drawn, and a lot of studies require blood draws. So I would be definitely wondering what if you have to do that or not. So those are the types of things I'd be looking for.
That's very helpful. And I'm curious how eligibility requirements are set and what factors go into the decision making of that, because several folks during your talk were trying to understand how age plays a factor into whether or not they're eligible or not, and how that gets determined. So we'd
Sure.
love your insider information on
Yeah.
that.
So that's a really great question. There's so many things that go into it that I could probably talk about this for an hour, but I'll try to keep it brief. The first and foremost thing is safety. It's the first thing that we do to design entry criteria, right? Whatever, if especially for drugs, especially for new drugs that have just come to market, right? Or drugs that are being repurposed. We know that there are certain things that predispose people to risk. They have to be excluded. So that's the first thing we look at. The second thing pertains to that assay sensitivity thing I was talking about. So the more variable, and that means like the more different people are in a group, the harder it is to see a difference between groups. It's just a statistical phenomenon. And so a lot of entry criteria are designed to make the population more similar to each other, more what we call homogeneous, so we can see a difference if there is one. Because as great as it would be to allow everyone in, if our trial doesn't have assay sensitivity and we end up saying like, oh, this drug doesn't work when it actually does, that's going to hurt everyone in the long run. And so, example, you brought up age. It is a good example, especially in the peripheral neuropathy space, because as we age, everyone starts to get peripheral neuropathy, right? It's subclinical. If you don't have a condition that causes it, it's potentially subclinical, but our ability to feel things, the way our nerves work, they change as we age. So if we allowed people to be enrolled who are much older, it could affect the outcome, because it just of natural age fluctuations in people's peripheral nervous systems. So these are the types of things that go into it, right? A lot of times people will be excluded because they have, a serious mental health condition. That could be related to how their different outcomes might be affected. So all of these things, the reason we do it is because we're trying to balance, again, that generalizability. Who will these results apply to? And we want to make sure that if we have a drug that really works, we can see it. Is that clear enough, or do you want more specifics? I'm not sure.
I think that's great, but obviously, if more specifics are involved, I'll see some more questions
Okay.
pop up through the chat box. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so how long, this might be an impossible question, so I
Okay.
apologize, but how long does it take for a successful trial to result in some type of approved treatment or new discovery?
Oh,
I'm sure the answer is going to be it varies, but I'm just
yeah.
curious. Yeah.
So all the way from phase one to like approval is like decade, like it could be decade. A specific study alone, from the time of like, oh god, it depends, right? Because like if you're doing an NIH study like me, I have to come up with the idea, I have to write the grant, which takes like 2 cycles, so that's a year. Then I have to, so probably like 5 years, right? If it's an industry study, it can be a lot faster. They're a lot more efficient. They have a lot more resources. But I would say from start to finish of like starting a clinical trial, if it's a really efficient multi-site study, ending it, getting the results done, maybe like 2 or 3 years is feasible to happen. Um, and usually and that's why it's so hard sometimes to join a clinical trial, right? Because you won't even know for another like couple years what group you were assigned to, or if it even worked. But if a trial is done well, at least at the end of the study, they'll tell you what group you were assigned to, and they'll tell you, like, they'll give you a synopsis of the results as the participant.
Great, that's very helpful. So, are there any trials that focus on other treatments for specifically painful neuropathic symptoms, such as medical marijuana? Are those things that end up in the trial space, or is that usually set aside to a different kind of testing area?
It's probably not your question, but is the question specifically about medical marijuana or just like anything for painful neuropathy?
Well, it was specifically for cannabis and medical marijuana,
Yeah.
but I think it stems a larger and broader question of when you get outside of medications and pills and
Okay.
also wearable devices, if
Hmm.
those kind of treatment modalities ever touch a clinical
Yes.
trial or not.
Okay, so not drugs, not devices.
Correct.
So for cannabis, it's really hard to do a cannabis study for a lot of reasons. One, depending on if it's a multi-site study, you've got legality issues going on. That makes it hard. Two, people can get cannabis fairly easily on their own. So that makes it a little bit hard for them to want to join. But there are ways to make it, I think that there are ways to make it appealing. Um, but so I would say that tends to be the challenge. And I don't know of any studies personally that are enrolling right now, but that would be a great question for clinicaltrials.gov, because if there is a randomized clinical trial that's enrolling, it has to be on clinicaltrials.gov. So you could just go there and search peripheral neuropathy pain and cannabis and marijuana, and you can find any trials that are going. I think for me, because I've actually thought about doing a cannabis trial before, I think one of the benefits I would say if I were a person thinking about joining a trial is that the source is going to be good, right? It's not going to have anything in it, and it's going to be pure, and also obviously you're contributing to research as well. Um, one thing, another, going back to that first question, one thing with my own clinical trials when I design them myself that I try really hard to incorporate is that once the study's over, the people in the placebo group will get the active. And I think that's something that as if if my mom was saying, I want to join a clinical trial, what do you think that would be like the first thing I would look at. There are obviously times it's not possible, and there are times when it's prohibitive based because of money. But I could see that would be a place where in a cannabis trial, it could be possible, right? Because it's something that's available freely. You can prescribe it to people. So yeah, I would look on clinicaltrials.gov. That's a very long-winded answer for that.
No, but that was very perfect. So I appreciate that. How would you advise patients being able to advocate themselves and on behalf of this neuropathy community for more research or trials to be conducted specific to their type of neuropathy, right? So we're having lots of folks asking about idiopathic or chemo-induced neuropathy or other specific types of toxic related neuropathies. So I'm curious if there aren't any trials currently in those areas,
Mhm.
how can they help get that started if there's any way that that type of grassroots advocacy effort is even feasible?
So two things I would say. One is it's a very appropriate question for me personally right now because and Lindsay, you know this, so maybe you did it on purpose for me. If you did, I appreciate you. So I'm trying to push for this concept of doing peripheral neuropathy as long as people have, distal sensory polyneuropathy, which is kind of that stocking glove distribution, not focal, meaning not from like an injury to a specific nerve, all in one trial. because people present with very similar symptoms, very similar signs. Although it's variable between people, it's not variable between the different types of causes of neuropathy. So I'm really trying to push right now personally, in my own work, for having this be a single diagnosis, and it will make it so much easier to do trials. It'll make the results more generalizable to everyone. So that's one note. But that's a little bit off of what you were asking. When you're asking about, so I guess the real answer is I wish I knew. Like, I don't know, because it all comes down to money and what's fundable. Because I, as a researcher, as much as I would love to do a clinical trial on something, if I can't get someone to fund it, I can't do it. So, so I guess it's something I really have to think hard about and maybe get back to you, because I really don't know the answer.
Okay, no problem. Apologies. Sometimes my questions are easy, slam dunks, and other ones are more challenging. But this will be the fun game we play for the remainder of time. We're talking obviously a lot about US based trials. Are you familiar with any trials that happen outside of this country, and specifically what resources patients can refer to? My assumption, and maybe I'm just a novice in this area, is clinicaltrials.gov is specific to the US. So what happens outside of our country? There's got to be something happening in Europe or South America. Are you familiar with that?
I am not familiar with that, but I'm pretty sure that those countries have something like clinicaltrials.gov, because I know that China does, because sometimes I review trials that have been done in China, and they've registered on the Chinese like version of clinicaltrials.gov. So I would just Google, like, what is the European version of clinicaltrials.gov, and I'm sure it will come up, and then you can search that way. Of course, there's definitely research being done in other countries, and there could be other opportunities if you're available or willing to travel.
And Dr. Gawanter, do you know who, other than, right, when it's your trial, you're steering it, right? Are there pharmaceutical companies or other device companies that steer those trials, and maybe there should be a little bit of a, buyer beware or warning because of um, possibly the conflict of interest or anything that is happening on the for-profit side.
Yeah.
Curious if you have any thoughts about that.
I do have thoughts on that. So that was an easy one. So first of all, companies, when they design clinical trials, they often consult experts like me. I consult with Lilly, I consult with Vertex, and so they are getting input from people like me. And I think it's just like me. They want to be able to show a treatment works if it works, right? And I want to be able to show a treatment doesn't work if it doesn't work. And maybe there's a little less of that motivation with companies, but not really, actually. Because if you think about it, during phase two, if you go back, if you think about the diagram I showed you, they want to know what treatment doesn't work if it doesn't work, because they don't want to waste their time and money going to phase three, right? And so there's always, full disclosure, I do consulting. I'm a firm believer in, there's no way on earth I'm getting a new treatment to market actually to touch patients without industry. And they're my partners, they're not my enemies. I totally believe that. So, you have to take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, from knowing that that's my perspective. But industry trials are regulated way more than an academic trial is. When you think about academics, I have conflicts of interest, right? I want to get my NIH grant funded. That's how I get to the next step of my career. And if I don't show a positive result that's interesting, I'm not getting to the next step of my career. I personally think I'd rather get a new job than waste people's time, energy, and taxpayers' dollars on something that's not useful. But not every academic feels that way. And so I would say that you have to be just as careful when you're evaluating an academic clinical trial in terms of potential conflicts of interest as you do pharmaceutical companies. And that pharmaceutical companies are regulated so much more tightly because they're regulated by the FDA than academia. And yes, of course they want to make money. I mean, like, that's the way of the world. That's the way of America, right? Like, but I think that they want, like, I know a lot of these people, they're good people who really want to find something that works for people, right? And of course, they also want to make money while doing it. But I would say when they design their trials, they're interested in finding and doing outcomes that are important to people that are assay sensitive. They're interested in that balance. It's always a balance, right? Of course, the most important outcome is your life better, but like, am I going to change someone's overall life with a pain outcome in a pain trial? Maybe not. So, we're always balancing these things. And also the other thing I would say is that the FDA has really pushed patient input, and their whole thing is like they want to know, is the outcome relevant to how people feel, function, and survive? So the FDA's oversight of that and their kind of guidelines in that have pushed industry to have to make a trial done in such a way that it will be legitimate in terms of the outcomes. So I guess that's what I would say about
That's really helpful. And, you briefly touched on this, right? So, especially for folks that take the placebo, they usually get the actual treatment following, and that's at least the goal. And that's something that a participant should be looking into before signing up. Out of curiosity, what other follow up, if any, are done with those patients after a trial, right? So if I've just dedicated my time and my energy into helping this research, I'm very interested to see what comes of it, whether it's in a month, a year, or 10 years down the road. Curious what the protocol is for that type of follow up.
Yeah, so I can only speak to studies that I've been involved in. But when I design a study, and actually all of the industry studies I have been involved in, have given a summary, a high level summary of the outcomes of the trial to give to the patients after, and have unblinded the site staff, and with the understanding that they will then contact and tell the participants which group they were in. I think one place we could get better as a group, and this is something that I work with my patient partner, I have a patient advisory board, and that I work hard to make sure, is that the way those results are presented is understandable, right? Because the way I read a protocol synopsis, or like a result synopsis, like my eyes are trained. I've been doing this for 15 years. My eyes are trained to look for very specific things, and I can immediately understand, did it work? Didn't it work? What were the shortcomings? But that's not true for the layperson who doesn't know about clinical trials, or hasn't been thinking about them for 15 years. So we've been starting to think a lot more about how do we present those results. Does it require a phone call? Is it just a flyer that has the top line results? That graph I showed you at the beginning to talk about the placebo response, and I was like, as I flipped it up there, I was like, this is so intuitive to me, but probably not to most people. So that's how I would gravitate towards showing the results, would be to show a graph like that. But is that really understandable to people? And so we've been spending a lot of time in my research group lately thinking about that in particular, because we're starting a clinical trial actually soon, for peripheral neuropathy, the kind of all comers peripheral neuropathy. And actually, it's a crossover study. And at the end of the trial, for each person, we're telling everyone their results. And it's because it's not designed for efficacy, so we can get away with it, unblinding people during. But it's a crossover trial. So there are the very interesting implications of what the results might mean. And I've been working with my patient board for a long time to make sure that we tell people enough information that they can understand it and explain it in a way that's understandable. And I think that's a place that we as a field in general could really benefit from a little bit more work going forward.
That's fantastic. And yeah, I think I would echo that as well. So I appreciate that answer very much. Another question just recently came in, and this kind of has to do with, right, the new administration coming and some of the restrictions on some of the funding that's happening. And you kind of briefly touched on it with respect to some of the NIH grants. And we're just curious, are you concerned about the impact of some of these potential restrictions on new researchers trying to get into the field, inclusive of those abroad, right, outside of the United States, and the ability for them to conduct their research if some of the restrictions and budgetary implications, continue down the path as we've seen it over the last 6 months?
I think the short answer is, of course, I am.
Yes.
um, but I think we have to wait and see. I think I think everything is so uncertain. Everything is changing so much all the time. And the budget has not been passed for NIH for next year yet, so we don't really know. And so I think I range from day to day from like, oh my God, the sky's falling. Even I, who am already fairly established, I'm never going to make it in this field, to let's just wait and see what happens. It might be okay. So I think we need to take a breath and think. But um, I do think that it has opened a lot of people who work in the same place that I work, opened our eyes, or like the same environment, that we need to be a little bit more flexible and open to partnering with industry and other sources of funding for our work. I feel very, very fortunate that I've already kind of been doing that myself. Like I have industry studies and NIH studies. And I think it's an important thing to think about because, for so long, a lot of people have just focused only on government funding, and we need to protect ourselves and try make sure that our fields don't suffer because we haven't been a little bit more imaginative in how we can work with different partners than just the NIH to get our work done.
Yeah, and I think, and maybe I set myself up for this one as well, right? So the Foundation for Peripheral Neuropathy, is obviously so sad to hear that all of that is happening. But at the end of the day, we do applaud kind of not relying on the one pot, right? And how we can also kind of bridge the gap in this transition period for many institutions that are feeling that through other scholarships and other grants that we offer. So yeah, we're just always curious to see how it's impacting, and specifically in the space of clinical trials and patients that suffer from neuropathy, wanting to ensure that progress for research continues.
Yeah. Is that another question? I'm not sure.
No, it wasn't. It was just a statement. You were like, yeah, yeah, yes, yes. So,
Oh, I love that.
no,
No, but I
I,
agree with you. Like, it is particularly worrisome for junior people, right? Because, like, for me, I'm pretty established. I could probably weather a couple of years, and so people who are just trying to break in. So I guess I would say if you had some mechanism for bridge funding for people who have a really promising idea that's, obviously you're not going to pay for a $20 million clinical trial, but, something promising that's a little bit less expensive, or even paying for part of it to keep them afloat or keep them funded so that they can continue to try to write grants, or maybe even, get to a month, a year and a half from now, and hopefully things change.
yes.
I think that would be a really great way to invest money if you have some.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gawanter. We've really covered a lot of really helpful information. I hope patients continue to feel empowered and hopeful to undergo and participate in research and a clinical study. So, thank you again for your time and expertise.
Or
For everyone here, we hope that you enjoyed the program at least as much as I did. I learned a lot today. We hope that you will let us know how we can continue to support you, and we ask in return that you continue to also support us. And if you have any other questions or needs, as always, we are always here to help. That is pretty much why we are here, to help service and bridge the gap and make sure that patients feel supported in their journey. So again, Dr. Gawanter, we really appreciate your time and support today.
yeah, and if you want, when you send out the slides, you can include my email if people have questions that they'd like to ask me, or if people want to try to get involved in research and they need some help. I'd be happy to answer questions.
That's amazing. Thank you very much. We might take you up on that. And I know several folks have requested more information about you, including where you've published, so that they can read more about some of the research you're doing. So we'll be sure to do that type of follow-up post this program.
Thank you. Thanks for your
All
time and
right.
attention, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you so very much. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.